Maya Jackson arrived at the airport with a calm smile on her face. It was early morning, and the place was already crowded with people rushing to catch their flights. Maya moved quietly through the busy terminal, wearing an old hoodie, a pair of faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. She carried a small, worn leather bag over her shoulder. Nothing about her looked rich or important. In fact, most people wouldn't even notice her if she walked by. She headed straight to the first-class check-in counter. The woman behind the desk looked up, her eyes scanning Maya from head to toe. She raised an eyebrow, as if wondering if Maya had made a mistake. Still, she forced a polite smile and asked for her ticket. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, showing the e-ticket. The attendant's smile faded just a little, but she printed the boarding pass without saying much. As Maya took the pass, she noticed a few people in line glancing at her. Some whispered to each other, and she could feel their eyes on her back as she walked toward the gate. Waiting in the first-class boarding line, Maya stood quietly, scrolling through her phone. Around her, other passengers wore sharp suits, shiny watches, and designer luggage. They spoke loudly about business meetings and holidays in expensive places. Maya didn't mind. She was used to this, but the stares didn't stop. One tall man in a gray suit standing behind her seemed especially annoyed. He kept looking at her shoes, her bag, then her face. Finally, he leaned toward the woman next to him and said, "Must be a mistake. No way she's flying first class." Maya heard it, but she didn't react. She had learned long ago that some people judged by what they saw, not what they knew. When it was time to board, Maya handed her pass to the flight attendant. The woman smiled, then quickly frowned as she read the seat number. She looked up at Maya, confused. "Are you sure this is your seat?" the attendant asked, her voice polite but unsure. Maya nodded. "Yes, it's right there on the pass." The attendant hesitated, then let her through. As Maya walked down the jet bridge to the plane, she could feel the eyes behind her. Some passengers seemed amused, others annoyed. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin sparkled with wide seats, soft lighting, and the soft hum of quiet conversations. Maya found her seat and placed her bag under the chair. Before she could sit, a man sitting across the aisle called for the flight attendant. "I think she's in the wrong section," he said, nodding toward Maya. The attendant sighed and walked back over. "Miss, can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Maya handed it over, her face calm. She knew what was coming. It wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The flight attendant stood in front of Maya, looking at the boarding pass and then back at her, her expression uneasy. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her tone polite but filled with uncertainty. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake. This seat is for someone else." Maya raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "I'm sure this is my seat," she replied softly, pointing to the number on her ticket. She had flown first class plenty of times before, and there was no reason to doubt it now. But the attendant didn't seem convinced. The woman glanced over her shoulder toward the businessman across the aisle, who was still watching with a smug grin. His eyes danced with the kind of judgment that Maya knew all too well. "Maybe you could check again," he suggested, his voice dripping with unspoken criticism. Maya felt the weight of his gaze but refused to let it bother her. The attendant hesitated, her fingers hovering over the tablet in her hand. After a long pause, she looked back at Maya. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to double-check with the cabin manager." She walked away quickly, still holding the boarding pass as if it was something suspicious. The businessman's grin widened and he leaned back in his seat, obviously pleased to see someone else questioning Maya's place in the cabin. Maya sat down in her seat, her fingers gently tapping the armrest. She could feel the stares from other passengers, some curious, some judging. In the quiet hum of the plane, the awkwardness seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Maya took a deep breath and looked out the window. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also wasn't going to apologize for being there. Minutes passed, and the flight attendants bustled around, preparing the cabin for departure. Finally, the cabin manager arrived. She walked toward Maya, looking at her with the same curious expression. The woman glanced at the boarding pass, then at Maya, before pulling out her phone. "Just one moment," she said, her voice sounding a bit more official. As the cabin manager began typing on her phone, Maya could feel the tension rise around her. She saw people whispering to each other, some pointing discreetly in her direction. She could hear the faint clicks of camera phones, capturing the unusual scene. Maya knew what was happening. They didn't believe she belonged here. The doubt was thick in the air, and it was clear that the staff was about to make her move to a different seat. The cabin manager's phone buzzed, and the woman looked down at it. Her face changed from concern to surprise, then to something close to embarrassment. She quickly showed the screen to the flight attendant standing beside her. "This can't be right," the cabin manager muttered. Maya didn't react immediately. She already knew what was coming, but she couldn't help but notice the shift in the staff's body language. The flight attendant, now a little more flustered, turned to the businessman across the aisle. "Sir, I think you may have misunderstood," she started, but Maya couldn't hear the rest over the pounding of her own heartbeat. It was happening again. The cabin manager cleared her throat, looking back and forth between Maya and the businessman. "I'm terribly sorry, miss," she said, now speaking directly to Maya. Her voice was apologetic, but also a bit shaky. "There seems to have been a mistake. You're actually the CEO of Sky Airways, aren't you?" Maya nodded slowly, her calm expression never changing. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady. The flight attendant standing next to her looked like she might faint, her eyes wide in disbelief. The businessman across the aisle, who had been sitting up straighter just moments before, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face turned bright red. The cabin manager's hands shook as she pulled up something on her phone, showing the screen to the flight attendant. Maya could see her name clearly on the profile, her title underneath it. "Oh my God," the cabin manager whispered, before quickly turning to Maya. "I am so sorry. I didn't realize. Please forgive me." The businessman, who had been watching the scene unfold, was now clearly mortified. His confident, judgmental expression had crumbled into one of embarrassment. His earlier attitude had completely vanished, replaced by an awkward silence. He shifted in his seat and tried to look busy, pretending he hadn't just been the first to question Maya's right to be in first class. "It's fine," Maya replied quietly, not looking at him. Her voice was calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been publicly questioned and humiliated. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. But the sting of being judged based on her appearance and not her achievements still burned under the surface. The cabin manager and flight attendant were now scrambling, offering all kinds of apologies, trying to make things right. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again," the cabin manager said, her tone almost frantic now. "We can move you to a more private space if you prefer, or you can have anything you need." "We're so sorry, Miss Jackson." Maya just nodded again, choosing not to react too much. "There's no need for all that," she said quietly. "I'm fine where I am." The cabin manager continued to apologize, but Maya could see that she was starting to feel the weight of the situation. Maya wasn't going to make a scene. That was just not her style. She had learned over the years to let her work speak for itself. She didn't need to argue with anyone or prove anything. She had built Sky Airways from the ground up, starting with nothing but a dream. That was enough. And if people wanted to question her, well, that was their issue, not hers. The businessman finally spoke up, his voice weak. "I didn't know. I had no idea." He stammered, clearly trying to backpedal. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Maya glanced at him for the first time since the confrontation had started. She gave him a small smile, not a mean one, but one that was kind, maybe even a little too kind for someone who had just judged her harshly. "No harm done," she said quietly, before turning back to the window, the conversation now over. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Maya leaned back in her seat, her thoughts calm. The world might judge her for what she wore or how she looked, but that didn't matter. She knew who she was, and that was enough. As the plane finally took off, the cabin settled into a soft hum of noise. Maya sat back in her seat, feeling the familiar vibrations of the aircraft lifting into the sky. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the rush of the takeoff wash over her. But the quiet was short-lived. Around her, passengers whispered in low voices, trying to piece together what had just happened. The businessman who had questioned her presence earlier was still fumbling with his phone, his fingers tapping nervously on the screen. Maya could see him glancing at her from the corner of her eye. He was probably looking up her name, probably realizing that the woman he had so quickly dismissed was, in fact, the owner of the very airline he was flying on. Maya couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking now. A woman in the row behind her leaned toward her friend and muttered, "She's the CEO of Sky Airways. Can you believe it?" The friend's voice was just loud enough for Maya to hear, but she didn't react. Instead, she let the conversation wash over her without interrupting. She had learned long ago that people would talk. They always did. What mattered most was that she stayed focused on what she had to do. The flight attendants, once awkward, were now trying to make up for their earlier mistake. One of them approached Maya with a tray of drinks and a small smile. "Would you like anything, Miss Jackson?" she asked, her tone now more respectful, more nervous than before. Maya glanced at her, then shook her head. "No, thank you," she said with a small smile, trying to ease the tension in the air. She didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. This wasn't about them. It was about her, and she was used to this. As the flight settled into a steady rhythm, Maya pulled out her laptop and began to work. She had emails to answer, calls to make, plans to finalize. Being the CEO of an airline meant there was always something to do, even while in the air. But she wasn't just answering business emails. She was also watching the reactions of the people around her. Some of them were still sneaking glances her way. Some were too embarrassed to look her directly in the eye. Maya understood. She'd been there before, underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. It was part of the game she had to play, even if it wasn't always fair. After a few minutes, a young woman sitting across the aisle from Maya hesitated for a moment before she spoke. "Excuse me, Miss Jackson," she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. Maya looked up, meeting her eyes. The young woman looked nervous, unsure if she should continue. "I just wanted to say, I really admire what you've done. It's inspiring." Maya smiled warmly, relieved that this conversation felt different. "Thank you," she said simply, closing her laptop. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it." The young woman's face brightened. "You must have faced so many challenges to get here," she said, her voice filled with respect. Maya nodded, her thoughts briefly drifting back to the long, difficult road she had traveled to get to this point. Every journey has its challenges. The key is to keep moving forward, no matter what people think. The young woman nodded, clearly moved by Maya's words. Around them, the plane continued its journey, and Maya felt a sense of quiet pride settle inside her. She had been judged for what she looked like, for what others assumed about her. But in that moment, as the woman across from her spoke with respect and admiration, Maya realized that her worth was no longer defined by the opinions of strangers. Her work, her perseverance, and her ability to rise above, that was what truly mattered. Maya's thoughts drifted back to the conversation with the young woman across the aisle, but her peace was short-lived. Suddenly, the flight attendant who had first questioned her presence returned, this time with the cabin manager in tow. They stood in front of Maya, looking almost like they were about to make a formal announcement. Maya raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. She had been through enough today to know that this was not the end of the situation. "Miss Jackson," the cabin manager began, her voice much softer now, "we deeply apologize for the confusion earlier. We were unaware of your identity and we should have recognized you immediately. We understand that this situation may have made you uncomfortable." Maya looked at them, nodding slowly. She wasn't angry, not anymore. "It's okay," she said calmly. "Mistakes happen." The flight attendant, who had been standing silently beside the cabin manager, finally spoke up. "We really admire what you've built with Sky Airways," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "It's just, sometimes it's hard for us to imagine someone like you flying with us, you know?" Maya looked at the attendant, processing her words. There was no malice in the flight attendant's voice, just the kind of innocent confusion that came from not understanding the larger picture. Maya had heard this kind of thing before, though. People often assumed that because she was a CEO, she must always be surrounded by luxury, that she was somehow different from others. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as an idea, an image. "I get it," Maya said, her voice steady. "It's easy to forget that people can wear different hats, right? Just because I'm a CEO doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to sit in economy or wear comfortable clothes. The cabin manager smiled, clearly relieved that Maya wasn't upset. Again, we apologize for the misunderstanding, she said. If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know. No need for anything extra, Maya replied with a soft shake of her head. I'm just here to get to my meeting, like everyone else. The cabin manager nodded, but it was clear that she was still uneasy. Of course. If you change your mind, please don't hesitate to ask. As they turned to leave, Maya caught the eyes of the businessman who had earlier doubted her. His face was red, his eyes darting away from hers. For a moment, Maya felt a small surge of satisfaction. He wasn't looking at her now with the same judgmental gaze he'd had when he first questioned her presence. His discomfort was almost visible. But Maya didn't dwell on it. She wasn't in the business of making people feel bad for their mistakes. After all, she had made her own share of misjudgments in her journey, especially in the early days of building Sky Airways. What mattered now was not the opinions of others, but the respect she had earned through hard work and determination. The plane continued its smooth flight, the noise of the engines a steady hum in the background. Maya glanced out the window, feeling the weight of her responsibilities settle in once again. But now there was a new sense of confidence in her. A quiet reminder that no one could define her by what she wore or how she appeared. She was more than that, much more. The plane continued its flight, the hours slipping by in a blur. Maya's laptop sat open on her tray table, but she wasn't focused on work. Instead, her mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter earlier. She hadn't expected to be questioned about her seat, especially not in front of everyone. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but today had felt different. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about how quickly people were willing to assume she didn't belong. Maya leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. She could still feel the weight of the stares from earlier, the whispers that filled the air around her. They had all been so sure of themselves, so convinced that a woman like her didn't belong in first class. But now the mood had shifted. The flight attendants had treated her with a mix of nervous respect. The businessman who had judged her was silent, his earlier bravado replaced by an uncomfortable, almost embarrassed energy. Maya didn't want to make anyone feel bad. That wasn't her style. But she couldn't ignore the small satisfaction she felt as she watched him fidget in his seat. His discomfort was a reminder of how quickly people could be humbled when they assumed they knew everything about someone. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Miss Jackson. Maya looked up and saw the young woman from across the aisle standing by her seat. She was holding a small bottle of water, looking uncertain. Hi, she said shyly, her eyes bright with curiosity. I just wanted to say thank you for what you said earlier, about not letting people judge you based on what you look like. Maya smiled, pleased that her words had made an impact. You're welcome, she said warmly. It's important to remember that people don't always see the full picture. Everyone has a story that isn't always obvious on the surface. The young woman nodded, clearly taking the words to heart. I think that's what I needed to hear today. It's easy to feel like you have to fit a certain image to be successful. But hearing you talk about how you've built your company, it just makes me think that maybe it's okay to be different. Maya's heart softened. She had worked so hard to build Sky Airways, not just as a business, but as a representation of her own values. She had built it to be inclusive, accessible, and a reflection of the diverse world she believed in. The path had never been easy, but moments like this made it all worth it. You don't need to fit anyone's idea of success, Maya said gently. The world is always trying to tell us who we should be, but the most important thing is to stay true to yourself. Trust your instincts and keep moving forward, even if others don't always understand. The young woman smiled, her expression a mixture of gratitude and newfound hope. Thank you, really. As the conversation ended and the young woman returned to her seat, Maya felt a quiet sense of pride wash over her. The moment wasn't just about proving she belonged in first class. It was about showing that appearances meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. Maya had learned that lesson the hard way over the years, and now it seemed like others were starting to understand it too. She glanced around the cabin once more. This time, no one was staring. No one was judging. The quiet respect that filled the air was enough to tell her that she had already won. The plane began its descent, the soft rumble of the engine signaling that they were approaching their destination. Maia's thoughts were still occupied by everything that had happened earlier. It was strange how one simple moment could shift the mood of an entire flight. The people who had once looked at her with confusion or judgment were now silent. The atmosphere in first class had changed, almost as if Maia's presence alone had shifted something in the air. As the seatbelt sign flickered on, Maia buckled herself in, preparing for the landing. She glanced around the cabin one last time. The businessman who had questioned her earlier was now quietly reading a newspaper, his earlier attitude completely gone. Even the flight attendants seemed to be going out of their way to make sure she was comfortable. Maia couldn't help but notice the way they now approached her with extra care, as if making sure nothing else would go wrong. She knew how easy it was for people to make assumptions based on appearances, and she understood that the world often judged women, especially women of color, based on how they looked rather than what they had accomplished. Maia had spent years building Sky Airways from the ground up, proving herself over and over again. But it wasn't just about the success of the airline. It was about what she had to endure to get there. The young woman who had spoken to Maia earlier returned to her seat, giving her a quick smile. Maia returned the smile, feeling the warmth spread inside her. It wasn't often that someone genuinely took the time to tell her that she had made a difference. Most of the time, people were too caught up in their own lives to notice. But this woman had heard something in her words, and now Maia felt like she had made a lasting impact. The plane touched down smoothly, and as it taxied toward the gate, Maia pulled out her phone and checked a few last emails. She had a busy day ahead of her, filled with meetings and decisions that would shape the future of Sky Airways. But for a moment, as the plane came to a stop and the crew began preparing for passengers to deboard, Maia allowed herself to breathe. She'd have faced a small battle today, not with competitors or the press, but with assumptions and prejudice, and she had won. The passengers began to rise from their seats, gathering their bags and preparing to leave. Maia stood up slowly, gathering her things. As she made her way to the exit, she noticed the cabin manager watching her. The woman gave a quick, almost apologetic smile, but Maia simply nodded. No words were needed. The situation had been awkward, yes, but it was over now. As Maia stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt the familiar rush of energy return. She had done what she set out to do, not just build a successful airline, but also challenge the way people saw her and others like her. And though she knew she would face more moments of doubt, she was ready, because she had already proven that nothing could stop her. Not the judgments of others, not the assumptions people made about her, and certainly not the limitations they tried to place on her. Maia was more than they realized, and she was just getting started. As Maia walked through the terminal, the usual chaos of people rushing in every direction surrounded her. But today, it felt different. She could hear the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the busy space, almost like she was in her own little bubble. The morning's events still lingered in her mind, but she was no longer bothered by them. The confrontation in first class had been unsettling at first, but now it seemed almost insignificant. After all, Maia had learned to deal with the opinions of others long ago. What mattered now was the work ahead of her. She pulled out her phone and quickly scanned through a few emails. There were flights to confirm, staffing decisions to make, and a series of meetings lined up for the day. Sky Airways was growing, and with growth came new challenges. Maia had always been up for the challenge, but today, the weight of the work felt a little lighter. Maybe it was because of the small victory she had won in the air, a reminder that no one could define her except herself. As she approached the door to the waiting car, her thoughts drifted back to the young woman on the plane who had expressed her gratitude. Maia smiled to herself, remembering the sincerity in the woman's voice. It had been a simple exchange, but sometimes that was all it took to remind her of why she worked so hard. People like the young woman were why she kept going. She wasn't just building an airline. She was building a legacy, one that would stand for something more than just profit. It was about showing people what was possible, regardless of their background, their appearance, or what others thought of them. The car door opened, and Maia slipped inside. The driver nodded respectfully as he pulled out of the parking lot. Heading toward the office, Maya didn't feel the need to say much. Her mind was already focused on what lay ahead. The rest of the world could think whatever it wanted. Maya had spent years fighting for her seat at the table, and now she knew better than to let anyone take that away from her. She thought about the businessman on the plane, who had been so quick to question her presence in first class. A small part of her wanted to confront him, to remind him that he had no right to judge her based on appearances. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. The world could assume all it wanted, but the truth was always there, in her work, in the decisions she made, in the company she had built from nothing. As the car drove through the city, Maya felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about living her truth. And the more she did that, the more she realized that no one could take that from her. The rest of the day unfolded like it always did. Meetings, phone calls, negotiations. Maya worked with the same focus she always had, but now there was a new sense of peace within her. Because she knew that no matter what anyone thought, no matter how many times she was underestimated, she had earned her place, and nothing could change that.